Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Myron Weiner Seminar Series that's sponsored by the Inter-University Committee on International Migration, which is a consortium of Boston area universities that has been going for almost 50 years. This is the last of our seminars for this academic year. And I want to take an opportunity, this opportunity to thank Laura Kerwin, who has been the coordinator of this program for the last couple of years. And she's moving on to greener pastures down the hall at the Center for International Studies, which is the host of today's events. Today we have a really interesting and for us, a slightly unusual set of presentations because they're very visually gripping and exciting. It comes from a book that you can purchase from the MIT Press called Designed to Live: Everyday Inventions from a Refugee Camp. And so we will be seeing how refugees themselves have been coping with their lives there and forming interesting ways of living and creating identity and community and so on. A very interesting book, and it's going to be a very interesting presentation. Let me just quickly introduce our three panelists, and then we'll let them go from there. Azra Akšamija is an artist and architectural historian. She is director and founder of the MIT Future Heritage Lab and associate professor in the MIT Department of Architecture and the program in Art, Culture, and Technology. Then we'll have Raafat Majzoub, who is an architect, artist, and writer. He's director of the CAN, the Arab Association for Prototyping Cultural Practices, and editor-in-chief of the Dongola Architecture Series. And lastly, we will have Melina, Philippou, who is an architect and urbanist, is program director at the MIT Future Heritage Lab, founder of Trapezui, a marble Objecthoods, and associate at the Department of City Planning, Ministry of Interior of Cyprus. So that's a mouthful. I hope you got it all, but there it is on your screen. A very interesting group. And with that, we'll just turn it over to Azra, please.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for hosting us. And I would ask my colleagues also to Raafat and Melina to turn on their videos and Melina to share the screen with you. We are really excited to be here. The MIT Art, Culture, Technology program has been actually collaborating for years with the Center for International Studies, and we are delighted to join you in this conversation today. The plan is that we take you through this recently published book, Designed to Live: Everyday Inventions from a Refugee Camp. That is a product of 5-6 years of collaborations across different geographies and institutions. Melina, could you share the screen, please? So we have organized this presentation together. I will start with introducing some of the questions and structure of the book. And then Melina will take it from there, and Raafat, and we'll kind of wrap it up together at the end. And we will have, after around 50-minute presentation, we will have question and answer session moderated by John. So next slide, please. So with the escalating war and destruction in Ukraine and the ongoing wars in Syria, Yemen, and Palestine, this book, Designed to Live, comes in at a very timely moment. At its core, the book is basically a story of design that is a testament to the ingenuity of the human spirit, foregrounding culture as an essential human need. As a process, Design to Live is a story of building bridges. This project was not born as a kind of book proposal in a traditional sense, but actually it was an organic story of becoming. In 2016, as the Syrian crisis and war was at its violent peak, and the destruction of Palmyra was kind of prompted this larger discussion on in the preservationist community, how do we deal with this cultural warfare as well. This larger questions of connecting humanitarian concerns and concerns of cultural preservation prompted a conversation at MIT regarding possible responses that would have impact beyond just theoretical commentary. Next, please. At that time, MIT was celebrating its 100th anniversary of the new campus. You remember the big festivities, and MIT community was invited to develop different projects that would celebrate this event. And but how was one to celebrate really? The Department of Architecture at the time when architectural marvels such as Palmyra and the World Heritage sites were systematically targeted and turned into sites of death. It was at that moment that I initiated the Memory Matrix project, a temporary monument that you see here in the images. And this monument is in a kind of continuous process of construction and destruction. It was born as a way to begin a non-hierarchical collaborative conversation about the role of culture and communities in transforming crisis. So you see here an installation, it was quite gigantic in the kind of T of the architectural MIT logo, where we installed border fences, chain link fences, and hung on them around 20,000 little pixels that were laser cut with holes outlining artifacts and monuments that were destroyed during our lifetime. And this piece was, there are different layers to it, but it was a kind of awareness raising and a collaborative effort to think about how do we connect with concerns of these remote sites in the world? How do we empathize with these places and with people? And what can we ultimately do from our place on campus to support the people experiencing acute moments of conflict and crisis? So in a kind of chain reaction, a momentum was created at MIT through this project that led us to the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, and also the foundation of the MIT Future Heritage Lab. And what we do, we are a kind of network of people working both at MIT, but in other places. Melina is in Nicosia, Raafat is in Beirut, but others in different places in Jordan. What we do is to collaborate across political and geographical borders, also disciplinary borders, to combine our skills and bring together these concerns of humanitarian relief with concerns of cultural preservation to support communities in conflict and crisis, and bring this cultural lens into responses to conflict and crisis. How do we do that? Next slide. We do that by looking at and learning from these places. So, for example, this image is quite striking, where you see the kind of replica of a Palmyra arch made to sit in front of these ready-made UNHCR shelters in Azra refugee camp in Jordan, juxtaposing the kind of two concepts of a shelter. The one in the back is the concept of a shelter, designed on the principles of engineering and the idea that human needs are based on a kind of food and roof above the head. And in front, you have this other image, other concept of the shelter designed by a Syrian man who sees culture and an emotional needs being foregrounded and addressed through a kind of cultural project, a cultural shelter that is, placed in the camp that gathers people and reminds them where they come from and that they indeed have history, memory, and identity. So this book, the Everyday Inventions in the Refugee Camp, Designed to Live It, brings art and design as a language of politics, social justice, and cultural continuity, and where we kind of counter the discussion about refugee camps that is usually framed within technical humanitarian policy lens to bring the kind of other voices and the language of design, which alters that external gaze and allows for collaborative form of engagement within the camp. So we see design as inherent human skill that can be a common denominator in the conversation between camp residents and visiting academics. And it is this intersectional and universal language that brings us to the table urgencies such as resource management, population governments, dwelling, heritage, and identity development. Next slide, please. So we have worked with a range of people and a range of lenses in this book. So one aspect that was important was collaborative innovation. So there was a range of projects and engagements with camp residents that led us to knowledge production. Next. Then working across generations and kind of in an inclusive form of design. Next. Another lens is the artistic expression. So a lot of the content in the book is digested through as a form of artistic expression. Next. And also the way we produced the book and worked with the people there was also about a kind of heritage transmission and like linking generations to continue cultural production in the camp. Next. So to the structure of the presentation today. So we are going to first now go into the urgencies for responses to displacement today. Then Melina is going to take us through the Azra refugee camp to give you the context of how these camps actually look like, talk about harms of encampment. Then Raafat is going to take over and talk about the design at the camp as a world-making practice. And we'll show you then a couple of examples of refugee-led art and design projects that people develop in the camp. And I will wrap up at the end with the process on like making of this book. And we will conclude with a short video clip that includes remarks by our Jordanian and Syrian collaborators. And we'll end it there and open for questions. Okay, I give now the word to Melina.
Thank you, Azra. So international concern over displacement increased radically in the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2016. In the picture, we see Syrian refugees moving from the border of Hungary towards Slovakia when Hungary announced the state of emergency and fenced its borders. Unfortunately, the number of forcibly displaced people globally has only been increasing ever since. Today, globally, there are 82 million forcibly displaced people. To put that into perspective, that would be double the population of Spain or the 20th most populated country in the world. Unfortunately, predictions for the future, especially taking into consideration climate change impact, are not more optimistic. According to the World Bank, by 2050, there are going to be 140 million forcibly displaced people due to climate change impacts. The reality is that within our own lifetime, it is very possible that we're going to witness displacement as a first-hand experience. Glimpses of our shared future may well be found in the present-day living situation of Syrian refugees at the Azra refugee camp. The predominant way the international community is looking at displacement today is addressing it either through admission, so asylum seeking processes, or through confinement in refugee camps or other temporary accommodation facilities. During the Syrian refugee crisis, the EU initially responded by opening its borders through the Eastern Mediterranean refugee route. And soon after, less than a year, this shifted into displacing responsibilities towards refugees through to the neighboring countries. So with agencies like Frontex that do border management and agreements like the EU-Turkey agreement, the EU-Jordan agreement, and the Jordan Compact, the EU funds and continue to fund third countries in order to receive and accommodate refugees in their own territory. As a direct outcome of these agreements, today Turkey is the top refugee host country in the world, and Jordan has increased its total population by 10%. Though most refugees in Jordan live in urban settings, 15% of that population is still living in refugee camps, one of the 15 refugee camps of the country. In this slide, we see Zaatari, a Jordanian refugee camp that is close to the Syrian border that accommodates approximately 140,000 refugees. It is the country's third largest city. When eventually Zaatari reached its full capacity in 2015, a new camp had to be built. The Azra camp is it's a centrally planned, it's a closed camp in the middle of the eastern Jordanian desert. It expands in about 15 square kilometers. Cambridge, Boston would be 18 square kilometers. And it's 90 kilometers away from the Syrian border and a 2-hour drive from Amman, which is the capital of the country. It is built to host approximately 130,000 refugees. That said, today it accommodates 40,000. Looking at the management of the camp, it is common that refugee camps are led by a governmental agency. In this case, it would be SRAD, the Syrian Refugee Affairs Directorate from the side of Jordan, with the support of the UNHCR, and then a conglomeration of about 50 NGOs that address specific issues within the camp. The Azra refugee camp was meant to be an advancement when it comes to the governance and security of institutional humanitarian infrastructure, a camp that was designed based to the success and failures of the Zaatari camp. So, for example, in comparison to Zaatari that was built directly next to the small city of Zaatari, the Azra refugee camp is 20 minutes away to the closest township. Also, in comparison to Zaatari that dynamically developed through time, Azra was centrally designed throughout from day one. So one would enter the camp from the highway, and then we see 4 distinct villages, each of which has its own educational facilities, facilities regarding to hygiene, and separate water points. Moving to the smallest collective unit, we would go to the village plot. The village plot consists of 12 shelters that share an open space in the middle and 4 latrines, 4 spaces for hygiene. And then the building unit of the camp is the tea shelter. The tea shelter is this 24 square meter, 1 space shelter. It arrives as a flat pack and it can be built in 2 to 3 hours. And it was built specifically for the case of Azra to be resilient to the temperature changes, to the winds of the Eastern Jordanian desert, etc. To one of those 24 square meter shelters, usually we find 4 to 5 people. Now, while Azra offers a safe environment to communities fleeing from violence and persecution, it is also an environment where human rights are violated, financial dependency is created, and living conditions are quite harsh. Azra is a fenced camp guarded by military presence in the middle of the desert. Even if there were no fences, there is nowhere for someone to go. One can exit the camp with a permit under the title of vacation. It is a space of confinement that restricts the right to the freedom of movement. Additionally, refugee camps restrict access to employment. In the case of Jordan, a refugee cannot create their own business, and they can participate to the primary sector of economy through the employment office that is within the camp. And these opportunities are occasional. They're nor periodical nor continuous. As a result of that, these restrictions of employment for refugees' engagement to the economy to be reduced to the passive acceptance of humanitarian assistance. So the current system, in a way, builds dependent communities and perpetuates the logic of humanitarian relief as philanthropy. Refugee camps have long been criticized by philosophical thinkers of our times as spaces deprived of humanity. Arendt, Agamben, and Agier argue that refugee camps reduce human life to the biological needs of the body, shelter, hygiene, food, while neglect what really makes us human, that being agency, emotional needs, cultural needs. So engaging with the camp acknowledging the harms of encampment as well as the limitations of humanitarian relief, we were interested, we wanted to build processes and co-create projects with our Syrian collaborators that counter and resist this current approach to refugee infrastructure. Raafat is going to say a bit more about our approach to design research at the camp.
Thank you, Melina. Okay, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so to tackle the issues mentioned by Melina, we decided to create a collaborative approach to counter the objectification of refugees and engage with the camp as a place that is generative and alive. In this picture, we see the Azra journal team, an entrepreneurial youth group that decided to create the camp's first magazine. This is important because it's a platform for refugee-led narratives on life at the camp, not an outsider's perspective. The insight of the journal team and extended network of residents helped shape the content of this book to make it relevant for readers inside and outside Al-Azra. Sorry. Okay. Designed to Live rejects the standardization policies in refugee camps and shows the possibilities of nuanced cultural engagement. This book reflects on camps with the lens of refugee agency, where residents literally design to live lives that are close to their cultural formation as possible. It's a valuable document for thinking about innovation, collaboration, authorship, cultural continuity, and world making. So we refer to Nelson Goodman's theory of world making and approach design at the camp as a process of plural construction of reality that is continuously in flux. In this story and in this reality, there's no one single author, but rather many that are contributing and negotiating like a bigger life narrative. And this allows us also to think beyond the institutional agency of the camp and think of refugees as ones with power and agency over their own life. Design enables this world making by being a universal tool for cultural production and adaptation. Through design, the refugees the standardization of their life and is imposed by humanitarian aid strategies that mainly focus on their basic needs. They appropriate the environment by interfering with forced systemization through creative ownership.
Next.
Melina, you're on mute.
Yes. So world making in this case is not only a theoretical lens, but also the way the book as a physical object is threaded together. So the book is structured around 4 drawings, 4 triptychs that bring together the designs, interventions, the artistic interventions of refugees in these 4 speculative scenes that distill life at the camp according to the creative community of refugees themselves, rather than the framework of managing displaced population. So the triptych on the picture is the triptych on landscape, and it showcases the transformations that Syrian refugees are doing to the desert in order to introduce flora and fauna that is reminiscent of the Syrian landscape. When it comes to the triptych on intimacy, we see negotiations that are happening when translating traditional concepts around sharing and privacy to the new environment of the camp. So we're talking about transitional spaces to ensure the privacy when entering the house, the traditional concept of the courtyard, and open air social spaces. Moving to the triptych that is related to fellowship, we see how the people at the camp are contesting the cultural austerity of the camp through reproduction of culture, like the Palmyra Gate, through rituals of coffee making, a fountain, murals that showcase ancient ruins of the homeland. And last, the triptych of energy showcases how people are finding workarounds to address the scarcity of resources within the camp. Altogether, these triptychs discuss life at the camp. They incorporate the language and position of design practices in order to center a conversation of refugee infrastructure on the issue of dignified living.
So these triptychs also offer a walk. It offers a walk for the reader to engage with world making as a refugee-led process happening on multiple scales. Design to Live does not show design proposals from our perspective as external professionals. but it shows how refugees are rethinking their own spaces through design and developing civic spaces for social healing, innovation, and cultural interaction. It's important to note that these inventions are not meant to stand alone, but are part of a social design network. And the value of these designs is not how unique they are each separately, but in how they are adapted to material scarcity and cater to social and cultural needs of specific users. The designs you will see in the following slides are highly personalized, customized, and shared throughout the camp. They expand the world of the residents beyond the standard humanitarian infrastructure.
So a representative example would be, for example, the continuation of the Majlis tradition. Majlis are these living spaces that operate in the community level as a forum for the community and in the level of the household as spaces for hospitality that are also have the official designation of UNESCO World Heritage. And we see this type of spaces throughout the camp. The one at the picture is from a household, from the household of Abdelrahman. And the following one is a community majlis. So the whole village decided to repurpose an empty shelter into a communal space. That's particularly fascinating, taking into consideration that formal public spaces outside the confines of community spaces that are run by NGOs are not allowed in the camp. So this shelter has been repurposed in order to be a space for hospitality. As we were going through the shelters in order to document the inventions of refugees, Abu Homsani, as the elder of the village, opened the space, welcomed us, prepared coffee, and discussed like issues of concern, made sure that we feel welcomed at this space. Now, design-wise, it's a great example of how the few materials that exist in the camp are repurposed in such a creative way. So what looks to be like a rug is nothing else by UNHCR tarpaulins that are patterned together. The upholstery of the ceiling, the tapestries are again humanitarian fabrics. And when it comes to the low seating and the interesting tapestry at the back, again, those are the mattresses that are used for sleeping at night, that are, the tapestry is just the UNHCR woolen blanket that we all know. And as Abu Homsani would say, the significance of these spaces is that majlis are schools, and especially for youth growing up at the camp without a lot of images of Syria, this is an excellent opportunity for the elderly to communicate with the youth and exchange stories. Another collective project that we see replicated a lot at the camp is the creation of a courtyard. So in this case, when it comes to a village plot, the village plot was fenced with a soft envelope, and then within this soft envelope, we have a courtyard that is protected, has a canopy, is paved, and has greenery by the side. So a gate is created to kind of like separate the street with this neighborhood unit, and also filters the gaze in order to allow household activities like hanging the clothes, doing laundry. And then within this courtyard, we see this beautiful canopy that protects from both rain and the sun. And this canopy again is created by the layering of humanitarian fabrics, the UNHCR wool blanket, and plastic sheets that are hung over laundry ropes. So all these are materials that are given to refugees upon their entry. And then, especially since the Azra camp is built on top of a dry riverbed and it floods a lot during the raining season, we see that the yard is paved, and it's paved in this very meticulous way. Like the people from this plot had to handpick all these stones during the rainy season when the stones go up in order to make sure that all of it is going to be paved. And then these plastic things that we see by the sides are barriers for the water not to enter the household. Last, what is particularly interesting and also showcases how simple things become so difficult in these circumstances is the way Syrians figure out a way to plant things. So in order for one to plant a jasmine flower, that's not possible at the camp. There are these UNHCR guidelines for the environmental sustainability of the site that at least in the case of the Azra camp, were translated in a way where planting was forbidden. So the people became very creative to overcome this difficulty, and they would either create vertical gardens, they would either repurpose different things as planters. For example, we've seen sewage lids being repurposed as planters, or they would envelop the garden into a plastic sheath. So the garden could grow, but enveloped into plastic rather than integrating the soil of the site. So another traditional item of the Arab house that we see recreated at the camp in multiple versions, like a concrete one, portable one, stable one, is the fountain. In this case, we see the fountain designed by a prolific designer at the camp, Abu Jar. What's particularly fascinating with this fountain is that it is portable and it's also reversible. So a set of buckets and then a component of the shisha are put together to create this fountain that does climate control for the camp, where the temperatures can go up to 48 Celsius during the summer months. But then when the summer is over, the set of buckets and the shisha can return back to their initial positions, and not any of the objects is compromised when it comes to the use. And that's particularly important to these spaces of resource scarcity. Back to you, Raafat.
Thanks. In this slide, we see some more inventions that are quite popular at the camp. These inventions specifically adapt cultural traditions despite the situation of scarcity that were mentioned earlier. So here we see activities such as pigeon breeding and oven adaptations that enable heritage practices to be passed on and live in the camp despite these situations. So these interventions are adopted by several families and are appropriate to fit specific needs, as is the case of most of the inventions at the camp. The political power of these designs comes from their versatility and adaptability, not from their specific artistic uniqueness. We see design here as a tool for social and cultural well-being that is predominantly collective. By using these existing materials, refugee-led designs subvert humanitarian aid relief systems and create culturally specific moments despite strict regulation. This process of exchange allows refugees to experience themselves as complex identities, whose work contributes to the well-being of their community. The world-making lens also allows us to acknowledge refugee camps as sites of knowledge production that is not only bound by the present situation, but is part of a bigger and much more complex narrative. Through our inquiry, we try to imagine the role of design and cultural innovation as bridges of heritage transmission. Design to Live shows examples of camp residents taking the lead in filling the gaps of spaces of expression. Refugee interventions are enabling moments of identity creation and identity evolution within the harshness of forced displacement. The structure in this picture is one of the most striking examples of practicing heritage. It innovates construction techniques to fit the strict building regulations of the camp. The arches, for example, offer a communal space of the camp that looks a bit more like home. These moments of congregation and ritual practice link the past to the future and highlight interconnectedness of these interventions. So by kind of showcasing that network, Design to Live also can be seen as a world-making practice itself, where we speculate in the near future subversive act of
we haven't heard your last sentence, but it's okay. I think we are dealing with challenges of working across borders. So now we are going to go into the process of the book, and which took place over the well, let's say 5 years we have been working in this camp, but the book was kind of envisioned from the very beginning. The process involved a collaboration across borders with particularly Azra journal team that Raafat mentioned, but also the humanitarian agencies, UNHCR and CARE. CARE particularly hosted this there and enabled kind of communication with people. And then we collaborated with faculty, students, and alumni from the German Jordanian University that was our local academic partner. And through series of collaborative workshops, the process was initiated. Also, Misty was kind of crucial in getting us actually to initiate that academic collaboration. We were, I think, one of the pilot of the Misty Arab World programs. Next, please. So we began the collaboration through the German Jordanian University, through workshops to see how can we be helpful. We are all designers, artists, urban planners, researchers with different skills. And what can we actually do? Where can this design skill come handy also to support humanitarian efforts? To do that, we needed to first create a community and establish relationships. So one was to work with a local academic partner. The other one was to work with a community in the camp. And here you see a first contact where we couldn't access the camp, but were meeting people through Skype at that time. Skype was the platform, introducing ourselves and kind of discussing problems. Next. Then after the next step was to go into the camp and kind of meet with the people and see, it was kind of unclear, like what can designers do? Most people who communicate with refugees are like humanitarian agencies. So to break up that dynamic of humanitarians are coming in, we organized creative workshops and we managed to actually bring an entire class into the camp. I mean, for one day, it was very difficult to get in there, but you see us here with MIT students, Syrian youth groups, and Jordanian colleagues in Azra camp doing kind of collaboration on site, brainstorming ideas for the camp, but that really visualize the problems. Next. And so the kind of on-site, off-site was one of the principles of collaboration, but also always bringing in this kind of disciplinary and transcultural exchange that was multi-directional. So people across different generations, across disciplinary borders, and across political borders was a kind of key to destabilize the dynamic of beneficiary and the provider. Next. Then, how to connect that work to what we do also at MIT. Some of the, we did research about the camp, but also this research informed the classes and the work done also at the German Jordanian University in Amman, but also at MIT. Students were, doing research into kind of humanitarian products. How does the aid work? Where does design come in addressing the needs? So you see here some of the slides with, in the middle, the one where a student is looking at the kind of packaging of humanitarian aid that potentially could be used as a way of also bringing in different materials that are scarce in the camp and as a way for people to self-design forms of environment, like changing the environment. On the left, you see a slide with our colleague, Mohammed Yagan, who is an expert in Islamic calligraphy and geometry, where we thought about different ways of using Islamic heritage as a way to kind of get students in the camp excited about learning and excited about this collaboration, but also to create simple principles that would enable a lot of people to work together on issues. Map them. Next. Then many of these findings, documentation of the inventions that actually came from the refugees themselves. They say, you have to see what people here are doing. It's kind of amazing. When we saw these photographs, it was quite incredible. And we collected some of their photographs and also conducted some of our own. This was exhibited at the Design for Nomadic World exhibition at the Amman Design Week, as a way of, documenting and bringing this material into a larger design discourse. Next. what was really beautiful is that through these collaborations, we were going into the camp, but we, for this particular exhibition, actually managed to get people out. And you never know what instances can be, most meaningful or effective. Bringing an entire class might have been completely cost ineffective as a form of addressing a need, but it was so symbolically important that an entire group would come in. But also this moment when we got a bunch of people out who have never been out, some of these kids have come in when they were, 8 years old, and they have never been outside of the camp. They haven't seen anything. And after seeing German Jordanian University, many of them were like inspired to start studying architecture or to start studying. And one of the most sad moments for me was when one kid asked me if she may look out of the window. So she had internalized that prison of the camp and was like not even daring to look outside of the window. So this is a kind of framing that kids grow up with through the way the space of the camp is designed and controlled. Next. So different types of processes were introduced. Sometimes, who takes the photography was important ethical question. So we had a photo workshop. The co-creation was an important vehicle to conceive and produce the book. So who takes the pictures, how are they taken, who writes the stories. So here we did a couple of workshops where students would kind of, based on the pictures that were collectively taken, then create stories and go interview and learn how to interview the inventors, and then write stories based on those interviews, because the stories and interviews had to be anonymized because a lot of these inventions are kind of against the rules of the camp. And we didn't want to bring anyone into difficulties. So result of some of that process are quite poetic and are part of the book. And I will take you through one of the poems that was collaboratively written that gives you a kind of perspective on the camp in a poetic sense. It goes like this: placed in a timeless space, trapped yet alive, a living part of the world. Here, dignity is invented, inspired by our heritage, overcoming scarcity to exceed your comforts, living memory of home, still human. So the poetic artistic approach, co-creation, transcultural dynamics was one approach, but the other was, in engagement with the people, but the other one was a kind of concerns over the ethics of intervening and working with fragile communities and how do we do that. And throughout the process, we have been working on this project called Code of Ethics that is something that began out of own dilemmas of how do we, work. I mean, just with the fact that we can leave the camp and they cannot. It creates this, very uncomfortable feeling of, and knowing that you are bringing potentially certain power dynamics and that need to be taken into account. And how do we acknowledge that, and how do we deal with that in our process? So here we worked with students to explore dilemmas and in the field of art and design, but then expanding beyond that next to look at other fields. And this took place in various forms, from exhibitions and conversations that engaged things like this little project called Code of Ethics Coins, where we extracted the questions that we learned from our process, and we are sharing them by inviting people to contribute to these questions and giving them money for it. But the money is designed, these are little coins that says good intentions on the other side, the road to hell, and then benefits and privilege as a kind of two sides of the coin, with a bittersweet taste of chocolate, which is a kind of feeling that you have when you work in these kinds of environments where you are doing meaningful work, but there's always this bittersweet taste of how much can one actually do and support and help. Next. Two larger projects that, like the symposium designed for the real world across scales that Melina organized in Amman together with Amman Design Week, colleagues bringing together artists, designers, and humanitarian workers to exchange that knowledge and their dilemmas across fields. And we, again, take our artistic spin next to organize these events through, for example, food, like curating the conversation through food. And hopefully disseminating this, this knowledge through online platforms. Melina, are we? I don't see the same slides. Okay, that's fine. I'll end it by that and leave you now with some of the voices of the people and what they thought, who are involved in producing this book, and what they think about some of the items that you have seen today. This is going to be a stroll through the camp.
إن الاختراعات في المخيم تنبع من الحاجة الإنسانية القوية للبقاء والتكيف مع ومقاومة كل المصاعب وفقدان الأحبة والظروف الصعبة والظروف المعيشية المجحفة كالتي كانت وما تزال في مخيم الأزرق. كان الوضع لا يحتمل وغير متوقع وبدائي بشكل كبير. كان هناك تناقض عظيم بين ما هو عالق في ذاكرتنا من الحياة الطبيعية الجميلة القديمة في سوريا وبين ما وجدناه عند وصولنا إلى المخيم. علاوة على ذلك فإن الاختراعات هي تجسيد أصيل للتراث السوري الغني والمتنوع، وهي تشكل وتؤلف مزيجا للهوية السورية. إن كل اختراع من هذه الاختراعات يعبر عن ويؤكد على ما هو ثمين وقيم عند صانعه، وما يعتبر جزءا لا يتجزأ منه، وهو ملتصق بعقله ومستقر في قلبه. تجسد هذه الاختراعات وترمز إلى معان مقدسة عند السوريين مثل التراث وكرم الضيافة والمناظر الخضراء والسلام النفسي والأمل والحب.
إن للابتكار دورا كبير في حل مشاكل وتطور المخيم، ونلاحظ في إحدى مواضيع الكتاب أنه تحدث عن المكيفات. فالمكيف يتكون من أدوات بسيطة موجودة في المخيم يمكن لأي شخص بناءه، وكما نعلم أن المكيف يوفر الراحة من الأجواء شديدة الحرارة.
الابتكار يعني من الأشياء اللي فعليا كان سبب من الأسباب الرئيسية خلينا نحكي استدامة المخيم أو استدامة اللاجئين داخل المخيم، لأنه من بعض الأمثلة اللي قدروا يتكيفوا مع الحرارة وحم الزينكو أو الشلتر اللي موجود، قدروا يخترعوا مكيف صحراوي من الصاج الحديد، نفس الوول كلادينج تاع الشلتر. قدروا يخترعوا مكيف صحراوي عشان يقدروا يعيشوا بالأجواء الحارة داخل المخيم. قدروا يصنعوا هاي أمثلة بسيطة جدا لقلة الوقت. قدروا يصنعوا عشان يقدروا يتنقلوا بين الأماكن البعيدة داخل المخيم وينقلوا أغراضهم. قدروا يصنعوا عربيات عن طريق البسكليت. قدروا يصنعوا عربيات هم صنعوها بنفسهم، عربيات نقل عن طريق البسكليت، تم شبكها، يمكن شفتها انت، تم شبكها عن طريق البسكليت، وبنقلوا فيها بضائع وبنقلوا فيها أشخاص، يعني الناس تنتقل فيها بين داخل المخيم من السوق للكرفاني لباب الزيارات.
One observation in particular I would like to speak about that I have witnessed in different refugee camps. I call this observation as reverse urbanization, and it is the process in which camp residents start to transform the humanitarian realm in which they live in, the refugee camp, the fixed housing units, the fixated infrastructure, into something that is more culturally, socially sensitive and appropriate for them, something with a human touch and better living condition.
This book comes in as an important reminder, an extremely important reminder, that those we call our beneficiaries have agencies, strong identities, and a living heritage that despite the rigidity of the camp, they will manage to reflect on their everyday life, not as a luxury, but as a necessity for making a living.
Great. Thank you, Melina. I think we can stop sharing now, screen, and turn it to the Q&A session.
Well, thank you so much, Azra, and all of you. It was such a rich presentation. I think I'm going to have to look at it again when we post it. And the book, of course. The questions that I have are rather pedestrian by comparison, but I think it gives context to the effort. One thing that I really like about your presentation is that you explained how you did this. I mean, you know, how you organized it, the collaborations and the difficulties. And one question I have in that vein is, how did UNHCR and other humanitarian agencies, NGOs, what have you, react to your effort? I mean, this is a very sizable effort involving a lot of, you know, things like materials and time and so on. What was the reaction of the agency? For those who don't know, UNHCR stands for UN High Commissioner for Refugees and is the main UN agency for displaced people.
Mm. Thank you, John, for this question. Well, the book hasn't been presented yet in the camp or to these agencies, so we don't have a direct feedback on the book. But on the research throughout, we do. In fact, the very beginning of this project was, and kind of us entering the Azra camp happened on the recommendation of UNHCR. I got connected through MIT to UNHCR engineers in Amman. and went there to see, okay, this is our group, this is what we are doing, we want to be helpful, how can we be without draining your resources, because, you know, there are a lot of researchers coming in, but what exactly are they contributing, and how, and it is an emergency situation, so it's really like you have to be mindful of how much time you take from these people. There are a lot of theses done and research, but they don't necessarily always translate into, you know, they help people to do their research, but it's not that they do anything with it. So we wanted to be mindful of that. And they told us, you know, there's a lot of work already happening in Zatari camp. You might want to look at the Azra camp. It was freshly built at the time, and there was literally nothing. There was no electricity. They connected us then from the UNHCR Central in Amman to the UNHCR, which governs the camp in Azraq, to provide us access. And then the UNHCR as an umbrella then connected us with CARE, you know, one of the subcontracting humanitarian agencies executing projects that related at that time to education, psychosocial activities, and a kind of cultural stuff. And so that was the beginning, and they were very keen on trying this. We were the, you know, the kind of test case of how can you actually, we were like the first people coming in as these cultural people. Everyone else is, you know, it's medical staff or security stuff, and how can we work with these external groups? And so we were kind of testing it for them. And in that sense, they were supportive, but the support was also, you know, I mean, you have to kind of learn about each other. What does the other need? And it took a lot of patience, I would say, on both ends. On the one hand, you know, it's extremely difficult working conditions. It's super hot. The regulations are constantly changing. You have to apply it like 2-3 months in advance to get permit to access a camp, and you may not get it. So sometimes they would just like buy our flight tickets and then not being able to get in there, and we are already in Amman. And I was like, okay, the regulations change. You can. So there was a lot of difficulties of the time, but I saw that there was an effort made from the humanitarian agencies to support this and look at this lens. Now, time will tell, I think, what the lessons learned from this process can contribute, because, you know, even like taking photography of stuff that's kind of not allowed, could be tricky. So we had to be very mindful of how do we do this in collaboration, and kind of filter things, and that could be useful. But Melina can tell you also more about, you know, some of the inventions, how they actually informed the changes in the humanitarian practices and regulations, right?
Yes. So what I wanted to start with is that you know, the humanitarian sector has some preconceived notions about how, you know, art and design can you know, contribute to the camp. How can that be beneficial? And I would say that, you know, in the beginning, when we started our collaboration with CARE at the camp, it would either be, you know, under the label of psychosocial activities, or under the label of, you know, skills that could eventually become income generation opportunities. So I would say that it was a long process until we were able to go outside these categories and that be welcomed. So that would be the first. Now, when it comes to the documentation of this project, I think a possible outcome would be that more people would know about them and more people could replicate them. And there were many of those designs that actually initiated shifts to local regulations. One of those would be the garden. So initially, planting directly to the soil was forbidden. So we see all these, you know, weird gardens, vertical gardens, enveloped gardens. Eventually, as people started doing it more and more and more, the interpretation of the guidelines on environmental regulations shifted, and now it was alive. It was allowed. Another thing was this addition that most refugees would do to their spaces. More or less, it was an addition of a hallway. So right now, initially, the shelter would have a door that opened directly to the street. So if one would open their door, one could see throughout the room, and the room was both a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, it was everything. So people shifted the windows and the doors in order for the door to be by the side that faces the wall of the shelter next to them, and then they would close it. And this it became such a common practice that eventually UNHCR came in and said, okay, we're doing this officially. And then this intervention, this edition became, part of the design of the camp. Raafat, am I forgetting a third one? I feel that there were more regulations. And then there were other interesting ways where refugees would figure out the workarounds to create things at the camp. So, for example, the reproduction of the Palmyra Gate. It's such unique design, but also such a smart design, because building new structures at the camp is not allowed. Again, because of these environmental regulations to retain the sustainability of the site. So you cannot call the replica of the Palmyra a building, right? Because it's made out of mud, and the mud is just the material of the desert. So it can be seen as a sculpture. So if it's seen as a sculpture, no one can say that it goes against regulation. So it was actually a very popular landmark for the camp, and humanitarian workers and people around the camp would go over there to take pictures and spend time. Eventually, it was not destroyed because of local regulations, but it was destroyed by some people that considered it to be, against religious to have such sculpture that people adored.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. In relation to that, I was struck by something Azra said at the outset, that the camp people were not allowed to make money. Is that right? I mean, was that across the board, that they could not work anywhere outside the camp, for example? But what I'm actually more interested in is sort of entrepreneurial activities inside the camp, which we have seen in other refugee camps in the region.
So this would change constantly during our time there and until today. So initially, working was not allowed. What did exist was voluntary incentives. So with participating to different activities at the camp, one would get a symbolic income for participating to these activities. And then working for non-governmental organizations within the camp, there were a few opportunities of this kind that I understand that NGOs would try to rotate throughout, people that were interested. Working outside the camp started after we visited the camp, like a few years after, and that would be to the primary sector of economy. So it would be in relation to the cultivation of the land, maybe some construction outside the camp. And again, those opportunities would be occasional. Entrepreneurial activities within the camp, we didn't find entrepreneurial activities within the camp, at least not to the extent of Zatari, where that's prominent and also well documented. It's one of these things that I don't think would be sanctioned, but people were not eager to showcase.
We have a question from Anna Hardman at Tufts University, one of our colleagues on the committee. What happens next, she asks. Worry about innovations, projects that start and end, leaving participants without long-term follow-up. This project both uses and adds human capital skills and active participation for camp residents. So what happens next? What's the next stage of this project, or what you anticipate the residents will take up?
This is an excellent question. There's a range of projects. I mean, this is, for us, this book was one step in the long-term process. We knew from the outset that, first we didn't know exactly what we can even achieve, but then we realized, okay, how not to be extractive. It means basically to create a long-term relationship, and the relationship has been created, and a community and conversation continues on WhatsApp. And like some of the kids we worked with are now studying, we're following them. I mean, one of them kind of actually went through Ukraine to manage to smuggle himself into Germany. So we follow through our social networks the lives of these people. But on the front of the content, there are several things still in the making. One is and it's a dilemma, right? Where can you be most effective with all of that? It was extremely difficult to achieve anything. So one thing that we are using both the book and some of these creative processes was to create educational content for the camp and also for broader art design sector. So some of this research was funded by a grant from Open Learning, and we are developing an online course called Design and Scarcity that learns from the inventions in the camp, but also, creates a pedagogy around the making for and learning from the camp. So that's something that can be disseminated in there, but also globally. This hopefully will come out in the fall. Then the book itself has been quite a vehicle unexpectedly, like it sold out within the first 3 months, and we are now in the second edition. We gave a lecture at the US State Department. So it's taking its own life in terms of taking these voices from the camp and then speaking directly to policy people, which I think it's quite amazing. We don't know where it's going to go, but it's making its round. The hope is also to continue developing the Code of Ethics project. I think, it was specific, like we started it to reflect on our own dilemmas, but then we learned about the capacity to create a broader dialogue, and that's something that I think that's really worth expanding. And then, to your point previously on a kind of income generation, and I think we tested and we have a proof of concept of a project that could become a kernel of a long-term engagement. Now, COVID has put a little bit on a hold of us accessing the camp, like basically for 2 or 3 years, nothing was going into the camp, not even humanitarians. So all these people we collaborated with, they have kind of gotten the keys from CARE and are running the show there because the limits have been put also for the humanitarian workers to get in there. But the project we have developed is something that we learned from Azra camp. Melina showed this nice picture of the Majlis and this kind of the way in the caravan was covered with these humanitarian textiles, where that they repurposed the core relief items, like the woolen blankets, to create on the one hand insulation and on the other hand sense of comfort. We have developed that concept into a kind of tapestries that are based on local traditions of tent making, but tested at MIT and developed them in terms of thermal properties. And they work with trash, with materials that are kind of available anywhere. So we've created a pedagogy based on this project and tested it in Zatari camp with a Norwegian Refugee Council and kind of vocational training facility where people get trained to, become cheap factory workers for the textile market. So we have tested one way of, learning from these inventions to create something that could be a product where maybe we commission the people to become their own designers. So, it's very difficult. How do you enter these places? So one way is as educator, one way could be as a client, and to subvert that system of exploitation to basically pay them to work for themselves. So that's one idea, because we have thought of models but for example, the co-op model is just not allowed for refugees. There's no way around it. So how do you create a framework that would help them emancipate themselves and then have some access? So one way could be to test some format of social entrepreneurship and through nonprofit and, but connecting education, design, and some sort of income. So we are there. COVID has put an interruption on it, but the plan is to continue, and it seems that there is a possibility to continue working in this.
We have another question. Saying, first of all, congratulating you on a great presentation. What do you say to people who claim that most camps in Jordan are hastily constructed, neglecting the cultural disposition of their inhabitants? Secondly, they are constructed to be used for a short period, but end up as a permanent abode. So questions about the sort of the hastiness of it all, or the transitory nature of the camps.
Well, I have some thoughts, but maybe I should give it to my collaborators.
Raafat, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, I think one way to start with this is like the book isn't an accusation of how things are done at the camp, because there's a lot of our interactions with people on the ground that actually, like, it's much more multi-layered than it seems. But one of the main points that also the book is making is that there is a major lack in the cultural kind of investment in what is happening at the camp. So I feel like, what would you say to the people? I would say like more projects are needed that engage with what these gaps are, rather than accusations. And I'm just trying to be as politically neutral as possible, and constructed to be used for short periods of time. This is the case everywhere. It's not just things that are happening in Jordan. And I feel like also kind of the perspective of thinking of these places as places of life rather than camps also helps to build a narrative outside of like the temporality, because also, as in the presentation, we are not just, the point of this book is not only to look at this one camp, but it's also to kind of acknowledge that forced displacement is something that we need to deal with as we are designing our new cities. So I think the transition and permanence is something that is up for question.
What I would like to add to that is that Jordan today is one of the top 5 host countries in the world, right? So it is a country that is receiving and accommodating refugees more than most countries in the world. Then when it comes to refugee camp, there is formal acknowledgement of their harms. Both UNHCR and IRC have published material that is advocating for moving forward from the policy of refugee camp towards urban integration. So this is something that, everyone acknowledges. I suppose the question is, how we move forward. Indeed, refugee camps, are this solution that is coming in as emergency response. However, emergency response in the case of crisis is never temporary. Like, there is so much time from the beginning of a crisis until one can return back and reconstruct. And it's never temporary. It's always within the span of years and years and years. Right now, we're in the it's 10 years after the beginning of the Syrian crisis. So what I want to say is that there is an acknowledgement of all the realities of refugee camps. When it comes to our participation and engagement with the camp, understanding that those people are in a condition that is particularly difficult, we wanted to focus our efforts there.
I want to add to this. I mean, if we could summarize three points, like refugee camps is not a solution. And okay, if we cannot switch that fast, then we need to have them, then we need to plan them as cities and not as camps. And this is kind of what this book is saying, is not how to make better camps, but it's like the camps can actually be, when you look at what people are doing, places where civic life and creativity and innovation can take place. There's a huge capacity that could be kind of embraced and potential. But of course, it would require shifting from this kind of security paradigm that the camps get justified with, that we need to provide safety for the people, but also safety from potentially radical people and them mixing with the locals. That's why they are always all put in remote locations to prevent that mixing with the hosts, long-term taking roots and so on. So this is a political issue, and it needs to be dealt on the kind of international level and political level. But what we see from the design perspective is there are huge problems based on that premise of temporality and the idea of the camp.
Have you examined other places? There are a lot of refugee camps in the world, for ideas about innovation, the kind of innovations you brought to the fore. Is there learning to be done from other places, and conversely, I guess through the book, but also maybe something more active, are you taking the lessons that you've learned from this research to other venues of displacement?
Well, we have had initiated a collaboration with JWEL to work in Rohingya camps, but it was quite complicated and complex. I mean, again, COVID hit an end to that. But to Anna Hartman's question before, I think it's a question where do you put, certain lessons are universal. That's why we call this book like Everyday Inventions from a refugee camp, even though it all comes from that Azra camp. Because there are certain universal lessons to be learned, like this kind of power of human spirit and ingenuity, and how we could learn from that and draw from it, that could be transmitted. But to do projects like this, it requires, and this is an ethical dilemma, right? How do you scale this up, and do you stay within one community and build long-term relationship, which would be a good point to not be extractive, right? But then even that, we had faced dilemmas like, okay, how much am I really contributing, and what justifies my flight ticket, environmentally speaking, financially speaking? Is it better to send that money to someone? Like, where can you increase the impact, and what is the objective? So I think there are so many complicated questions with it. And to do this nuanced work that we have developed over the 6 years, then in another place, are you just like satelliting yourself from crisis to crisis? Maybe going a deep dive in one place is important, and then connecting with others and exchanging lessons learned is perhaps a better impact. And I think one of the things we also learned here, and that's something we are trying to push at MIT, is there's big groups of people here trying to support refugees in different ways, for example, through education, is to, we have developed that one course, but what does it contribute to? Is there a curriculum that these refugees can take? Can they get a degree somewhere? We are a university, we are not a humanitarian agency. So how can this platform of open learning, for example, can it offer certain certificates and degrees that people could take and benefit from it? So these are forms of impact where the digital stuff can help and maybe alleviate the environmental burdens of traveling. But then, we use our own currency, which is this amazing university, to offer some sort of access. So there is no coordinated effort. I mean, there are certain universities like University of Geneva offering degrees. Can we plug into them and give our course? Would MIT be willing to offer a degree for refugees, right? So, and then again, you face another dilemma. You get a degree. Can you find work in the country where you are as a refugee? Because, for example, in Jordan, even if they study, they cannot work in all the fields. So there are a lot of complex questions that you will always have one foot in the dirt. That's why that coin, little benefits and privilege and road to hell is paved with good intentions, is the one that one is constantly facing when dealing with these with these subjects, and it's a matter of objectives and a kind of weighing where the biggest impact can be made with one's work. So
another aspect of this is whether or not your project and your innovations are infecting the field of architecture. I mean, is there a, not just at MIT, although you're in the Department of Architecture there, but in other places, is there some new emphasis on this kind of design, on this need that architects are taking up?
Yes, I would say that definitely there has been a social turn when it comes to architecture and design. And again, in the area of humanitarian relief, it takes different forms. We see entrepreneurial efforts that have to do with like design as problem solving in scale, like the IKEA flatback shelter. It has been, particularly, welcomed shelter in refugee camps. Then there is this approach on design that has to do with, psychosocial activities, as we said before. And then we also see minor practitioners contributing in refugee camps through design activism. But there's definitely an increased interest about design contributing to different global challenges over time. And there is definitely a big interest from the side of students, right? Because as soon as Azra started creating these courses, the interest was such that, it created the Future Heritage Lab. So I would say that there is definitely an interest in the sector. Then, another aspect of it is that getting into the camp, in the end, we were not that interested into contributing with our own designs. What we found interesting is that spatial practices themselves became a tool from the side of refugees to reconstruct even partly agency in their everyday life. And that was the important component for us, to showcase these designs, not as vernacular designs, not as informal design, but as, nuanced designs, with great impact in the everyday life that can be the central component of a book.
I feel like,
Go ahead, Raafat.
I just want to piggyback on what, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm back. So I just wanted to piggyback on what Melina was saying in terms of like I don't think architectural discourse is in itself something that is going to be pushed forward with this book, but rather kind of this conversation that the three of us were having in terms of who are we speaking to and how this could actually push forward humanitarian kind of like discourse and economy from a social perspective. Like, can we impact what is allowed at the camp just by kind of making a proof that people can and want to and have the energy to develop their own lives, right? So I feel like maybe if this also impacts the social sciences and how people that are trained to manage camps, just by seeing the fact that people don't need to be put in places, but rather they need to be given certain liberties that would allow them to activate the camp. I feel like this is some of the lessons learned takeaway from the book itself rather than the design perspective. Like using a design as a tool for life rather than design as a tool to teach designers. In a sense, I feel like if we can inspire designers to release a little bit of like an obsessive disorder with just like telling people what to do or the best practices based on professionals, then this book would have done something in terms of pushing forward like a more narrativity and cultural sensibility, and how even the macro definition of who a refugee is right, like, and dealt with.
The third also area is beyond the architecture and design. I mean, related field is the heritage preservation field, right? So there is a huge ethical dilemma there. In, when cities and monuments were bombed in Syria, everyone jumped on the wagon and we're like, oh, we need to help them. And we are from the West projecting our ideas on values of heritage that are mostly rooted in a kind of material dimensions. And thinking about restoring Syria, there is a huge opportunity to connect this process of restoration with restoring society on the kind of social level. And so work like this and methods introduced here could be a way to get there, rather than pouring all the money into restoration of Palmyra, which is actually something important, but again, it's the Westerners with 3D printing technologies and photogrammetry and who are kind of surveying and staging the rescue mission, or Putin on the other side. Where do you place those efforts? And so there is a shift in the preservation discourse also towards, especially when it comes to conflict and crisis, as these destructions are still happening, to look at the social and focus the efforts on these material values of heritage that are rooted in the social realm. So preserving ongoing cultural practices is one way of addressing conflict and crisis through the field of preservation. So, I've been presenting some of this material also to UNESCO and these people working with heritage, do you put the money into Palmyra, which is gonna be some power symbol of staging someone rescue mission, or do you put it into education of people in the refugee camp? What do we value more, and what are the kind of values of heritage that are impactful and instrumental on the ground? And so what this book does is to offer a method to do that, the human-centered approach to preservation in time of conflict and crisis. But other areas, here I'll be speaking at Solve next week. And Solve is the big flagship event of MIT that is kind of solving problems of the world, right? And I think, again, it comes from the wonderful MIT's, will to help and do things and solve for the world. But I think, here again, we need to learn from these places and not solve for, but solve with the people and learning from them. And I mean, it sounds cheesy, but it's really how do you avoid harm, and how do you impactfully and meaningfully use your resources to do something? Are you going to create a startup, or are you going to help them create a startup, right? These are big questions where we need to be just really also looking at ourselves and always asking what exactly are we doing. And I hope that this book will spark some of those reflections and inspire a kind of shift in thinking.
Well, we have to wrap up now. Thank you so much, all three of you. It really very rich, as I said, and worth getting the book for sure, and watching this session again. We'll be posting it very soon. It'll be announced on our YouTube channel. Wish you the best of luck, and thanks again. Good day.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.